Hi, my name is Natalia Lancaster, and my presentation is on taxonomy and its challenges. So we're going to start off on what is taxonomy. So basically what taxonomy is, it's a science that was created for the naming and describing and classifying of organisms, and it includes all plants, animals, and microorganisms of the world. It was founded by Carl Linnaeus. He's known as the father of taxonomy. And what he did was he used Latin words. We'll get into that a little bit more later. In biology, taxonomy includes 8 classifications, which are demonstrated in the pyramid below. So what I did is I went from the broad to the most narrow. So we start with domain at the very bottom, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So the term is derived from Greek words, and these Greek words are taxis, which means arrangement, and nomos, which means law. And if you see here, domain is the most general of the categories, and it starts breaking down these species into more more specific categories, which means that the characteristics start narrowing down until finally you get to the most specific category, which is species. Just to give you a little example, I included how a cat and a dog would be named according to taxonomy. So a cat would be Animalia chordata, Mammalia carnivora, Felidae, Filius, Catus, and a dog would be Animalia chordata, Mammalia carnivora, Canidae, Canis, Familiarius. And if you see here, since a cat and dog are mammals and they're not similar, but I guess in taxonomy in the most general categories, they might fall into the same buckets. So if you see here with their names, the only 3 that are different are the last 3 out of 8. So I'm going to explain a little bit about each classification. Domain is the most general, and it wasn't founded by Carl Linnaeus. It was actually founded a lot later. So this was founded in 1990 by a man by the name of Carl Wussy. And it is believed that the tree of life consists of 3 domains. These 3 domains are archaea, bacteria, eukarya. And just to give you a little background, archaea differ from bacteria in cell wall and differs from both bacteria and eukarya in RNA and membrane composition. They are also able to live in very extreme conditions. And eukarya has RNA distinct from archaea and bacteria. It is usually resistant to antibacterial antibiotics. So this is the most domain of the category. So what you do is you have a species, and first you categorize it by its domain. The next classification is kingdom. And if you see here, there are only 4 kingdoms. So the first one on the top left is Protista. It is usually single-celled organisms or groups of single cells. And an example would be an amoeba, and there's an amoeba there to the right. Under Protista, we have Animalia, and it is the most complex organism. They have to eat other organisms for survival, and they have no chlorophyll, so this means that they cannot make their own food. They move around, have organs, nervous systems. So examples of Animalia are insects, lizards, mammals. If you see there's a photo of a lizard. On the top right-hand corner, I have fungi. These are usually the decomposers and which absorb nutrients. And some examples are fungi, yeast, mold, mushrooms. There's also a photo there of some mushrooms. The next category is plantae. So plantae is basically plants, and they have chlorophyll, which allows them to make their own food, cell walls, and vacuoles. So examples include plants and algae. Next category we have is phylum. So phylum starts to break down by similar characteristics that include body composition. There are 36 recognized animal phyla. So they usually fall into 9 categories, which are mollusca, porifera, cnidaria, platyhelminthes. Some of these names are really hard to say. Nematode, Annelida, Arthropoda, Echinodermata, and Chordata. So just to give you a little example, I included phylum Mollusca, and there's some photos here to the right, and they are the second largest phylum following Arthropoda. They have advanced nervous system, soft-bodied, shelled, digestive glands. So this is just one example, one category, and there are some photos. Next classification is called class. So after you phylum, there it's class, and so I used the same example of mollusca. So mollusca is then broken down into 7 classes. There's a graphic here, and it only includes three classes, which is missing the other 4. But for example, on the left-hand side, we have the class Gastropoda, which is snails, slugs, conchs, periwinkles, and sea slugs. Then we have to the right of it the class Bivalvia, which are clams, oysters, mussels, and scallops. So this starts to break down the phylum into more specific categories. So that basically is what a class is. Finally, together I grouped order, family, and genus. So what they do is they define the categories even further. Genus is the first part to use the binomial nomenclature, which is the naming system. And so the first name is genus, and the second name is the species. So just to give you an example is Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus, and then sapiens would be the species. So to the right, I included this graph that shows you from the very beginning how they categorize these organisms. So we start with domain, and you see all these animals that we have. We have a tiger, a mushroom, a butterfly, a plant. Then it goes into the kingdom, the phylum, the class, the order, the family, the genus, and then the species. So you can see where it's order, family, and genus, how specific it starts to get. It really starts to get very, very, very narrow by these characteristics. And now is the species classification, which is the most specific. So members have similar characteristics, and usually the species that are in the same category can breed with one another and create offspring. This is part of the species is also part of the binomial nomenclature, how I had mentioned beforehand. So besides them being able to breed with one another, another way to define species are the karyotype, the DNA sequence, morphology, behavior, or ecological niche. So now that I described taxonomy and the classification system, how it goes from very broad to very specific, how these animals are grouped together by characteristics, not only physically, but how they interact with their environment, taxonomy has definitely had its challenges, and I will be discussing them. First of all, there's a shortage of taxonomists. It is a very, very complicated system, and you really do have to be an expert because there's so many organisms, animals, plants, that taxonomists really do need a very broad range of skills, and they need to have these broad range of skills, an expertise in them. So it's very, very complicated. So there's also millions of species that are undersubscribed, and there's very few taxonomists to take on this challenge. The study of taxonomy has also been declining in colleges, which is very concerning because we have this whole world of species that need to be identified, and with few taxonomists, it will be very challenging. There's also a great inability to identify organisms. Only 10% of vertebrates need to be identified, which is, I mean, that is very, very good because 90% are already identified, but more than 50% of terrestrial arthropods and 95% of protozoa have to be identified. This is huge, and the gray areas of these animals, under which categories they fall into, and knowing the specifics of all these organisms is very, very, very complex. Another challenge is definitely taxonomic information. Their formats and language are not for every country, since specimens of certain countries are usually studied in developing countries. So basically what happens is that in countries that are not developed, we have a huge range of organisms that need to be identified. And this system is not very easy, and it's not in the dialect of all these countries, so it makes it very complicated. And to have the resources in these countries to help out will be definitely a challenge, and it has been a challenge in the past. Taxonomy can also not, it's having trouble attracting funding. I read while researching for this project that it would take, I think, over like $50 billion in research and resources to be able to name the organisms that have not been named. Um, Also, taxonomy lacks achievable goals. From what I researched as well, taxonomists are very ambitious in their goals, and they set out to like to name all these species, and then they're not able to do so because it's so complex and takes so much work. And it has been estimated that there are 4 to 10 million species on Earth, and half of them haven't even been identified. Taxonomy also, one of its challenges is interpreting old systematics. So taxonomists spend a lot of time on this, and basically it's 19th century systematics, which is very outdated and definitely brings on a challenge. And there's also very little information readily available to the public. So that is definitely a challenge all in itself. Taxonomy is also viewed as intellectually unchallenging. It seems like, oh, when you talk about taxonomy, it's just the way you name species. But I can tell you from this research that I did, it is very complicated. It is not straightforward. It is straightforward because there's a classification system, but when you get to an organism and have to find the DNA, how it interacts with its environment, its physical properties, and sometimes there's gray areas, it's not very easy and it's very, very complicated. And it definitely requires, as I had mentioned before, very expert skills. And there has become this idea that that DNA comparisons are equally as useful, but this does not sit well with taxonomists because there's much more to science, and I and the identity and how they live and interact with the environment is very important. It's just not about what that organism is made out of. It's also its interaction with the environment and what it brings to the table, what it takes from the environment. It's very, very detailed, and these taxonomists really dig deep into how they name these species, and there's so much behind it. And really, after doing this project, I give them so much credit for this, and it really opened my eyes to taxonomy and science and this category that it becomes so broad to so specific, and all the work that goes behind it. Um, so I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you learned a little bit more about taxonomy and gained some light into some of the challenges that this topic faces. Thank you so much, and here are the references of all the resources I used for this.